Hey everybody, I'm Brad, and today I'd like to tell you how to take great landscape photographs in bad light. Let me show you how to set the camera first. This is the A6000, but if you're a Canon or Nikon shooter, you probably have these settings built into your camera as well. Sony has tried to make it so simple for us that it's actually gotten a little confusing. There's a number of ways to access these features, and the first is going to the menu, and we're on the first menu, the camera icon, first page. Go to the second page and scroll down to drive mode. And that's where you select whether you want single shooting or whether you want continuous shooting. You've got some self-timer settings, and then it'll bracket images. Finally, it'll bracket your white balance. And the last is DRO bracket. That stands for Dynamic Range Optimizer. Sony says if you've got a lot of difference between your brights and your darks in the photograph, in other words, if it's a very contrasty photograph, you can select DRO. And in the drive mode, you can select low or high. This is good for sports or action or anytime your subject is in motion in a very, very high contrast situation. It'll let you get a more detailed photograph. For now, I'm going to exit that menu, and we're going to run down to the fourth page. And again, you see DRO, Dynamic Range Optimizer, and HDR. We're going to go in there, and again, you've got the Dynamic Range Optimizer, but this time you can fine-tune how the camera is changing the contrast. You can select LV values 1 through 5 on this. The camera takes one picture and makes the corrections. The setting that I've been using is the HDR. And when you say HDR, high dynamic range, that's again a very contrasty photograph, but it works a little differently. In HDR, the camera actually takes 3 photographs. It takes one that's overexposed, one that's properly exposed, and one that's underexposed, and then it puts the 3 photographs together and processes one photograph. The thing that I like about the A6000 is when you're using this HDR feature, the camera will record to your memory card one properly exposed JPEG. So if you don't like your HDR results, you're not stuck with them. You've got that JPEG there on the memory card. Then in the HDR, you can select EV ranges 1 through 6. I generally shoot in 6, and I'll show you why in a minute, but what 6 does is it takes one photograph that's 3 full f-stops overexposed. That'll dig the details out of the shadows. One normal shot, and then one that's 3 full f-stops underexposed. And that puts the details back in your highlights, your sky, and your clouds. So let's look at the computer and take a look at some of these. I like practicing in cemeteries when I'm trying to sort out camera settings that I don't understand. I found that folks in cemeteries will pose for you for just hours and hours and hours and never complain. So this is the shot from Oakland Cemetery. This is the JPEG that the camera produced. It's kind of a nice shot, but it's a little bleak, a little bland. You can tell it was a January day, and this is kind of rough with this detail here. It's so deeply in the shadows in the very front. So the next shot, this is the HDR image. As we go back and forth between the two, look at this tombstone over here on the right, and look at the level of detail. If I overdo the HDR, all I have to do is come into my editing software, and I can add a little contrast and add just a little bit of saturation, and then I've got a really nice print that really pops. Here again is the JPEG, and here again is the tombstone. Here's a second shot. The statue, I put the sun directly behind the statue. When we go to the HDR image, you see the sky is actually a little bit darker, but you've got all of this detail here in the statue itself. Okay, so here's another example of maybe when to use DRO, or Dynamic Range Optimizer, instead of HDR. This is the original JPEG, so let's take a look at the HDR image. There's the original HDR. So the HDR image is actually pretty good. It put the detail back in the doors. It made the sky actually much less surreal. But let me show you this problem. Let's zoom into the to the image and go over here to these people that were in the shot. Because HDR takes 3 photographs and puts them together, it did some really crazy things with this lady as she was walking. So this is a situation where the dynamic range optimizer would have been a better choice. For some of you guys, you'll look at some of these and go, wow, I like the JPEG better. And that's the beautiful thing about the way the Sony A6000 deals with the HDR, is you've got that JPEG in case you do like it better. Okay, here's another really great example. This was taken very late in the day, almost right before sunset, and this was the JPEG. This is the HDR, and let's go back and forth between the original. Look how much the HDR photo, just the in-camera processing, brings out the detail. Almost like a raw image. Because I used +6 on the HDR, this image is actually a little flat looking. So let me show you a retouched version, and then here are the settings that I used in iPhoto to retouch this image. So again, original, and it's kind of a blocked up shot, the HDR, and then the processed HDR. And we'll kind of go back and forth between the HDR and the processed HDR. And this is actually, it looks a little over-processed probably, but this is what it really looked like that evening when I was actually out there taking these photographs. This was the Abbey at Atlanta's Westview Cemetery, and you can see that it was a nightmare because we had artificial light up here with some skylights. Then we had the sun streaming through stained glass windows, very dark areas, and dark wood and dark marble. This was the original shot, and then this is the HDR shot. And yes, this is all I did with this one was increase the contrast just ever so slightly. This shot here is one of my favorite shots. The processing on it, you can see what I did there, but one of the things that I discovered with the HDR that's just another benefit is it seems to have dramatic effects on noise reduction. This shot was actually shot at ISO 10,000. I would have never selected such a high ISO for this shot, and yet when we look at the shot, it's very clean. There's very little noise. I think I could easily make an 11 by 14 or 16 by 20 from this shot and have a very, very usable image. So I think by now you see, like I do, that it's very easy to get really nice detailed shots with your landscapes and your still lives using your in-camera HDR features. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and it's been a benefit for you. Thanks a lot.